With a sudden sense of purpose, Sarah turned to Daniel. "I'm done being silent," she declared, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "I'm not going to let them strip away my dignity any longer." Daniel looked at her, determination mirrored in his eyes. "You have to speak your truth, Sarah. You owe it to yourself and to everyone who doesn't have a voice." The words hit her like a wave of encouragement, igniting a fire that coursed through her veins. As the flight rolled toward its destination, Sarah felt the weight of anticipation build. She glanced at the other passengers, faces now trapped in a web of ignorance, unaware of the battle being waged within her. How dare they presume to judge her life without knowing her story? She took another deep breath, recalling her mentor's wise words, "Change doesn't happen passively, Sarah. You must demand it." It resonated fiercely within her as the plane cruised through the sky, the horizon ahead a canvas for her next steps. When they finally touched down, Sarah emerged with purpose, scanning the crowd in the terminal. She could feel the urgency coursing through her, a recognition that this was just the beginning. The world had turned a blind eye to racism for far too long, but she was prepared to shine a spotlight on it. In the days that followed, she crafted her message carefully, mixing her experiences with statistics and stories of others like her, those who had also suffered the indignities of prejudice in a society that tended to overlook them. This wasn't just about her, it was about the systemic walls that needed tearing down. Then came the day she posted her story on social media. The moment her fingers hit the send button, a rush of liberation washed over her. They thought they could get away with it, but they were wrong, she thought fiercely, as if channeling the energy of every oppressed voice into one powerful declaration. Her post went viral, and within hours, the world began to take notice. Messages of support flooded in from every corner, people sharing their own stories, standing in solidarity with her message. Sarah looked around her apartment, once a place filled with self-doubt and hesitation, and felt transformed. As her phone buzzed with notifications, she heard Daniel's voice in her head. "The world is watching you now, Sarah. Don't shy away from it." Every click of the message sound felt like a heartbeat, echoing a truth she had long fought to articulate. The comments came pouring in, passionate, inspiring, and demanding change. Sarah's heart swelled, realizing she had ignited something powerful. This was a movement in the making, and she was at its forefront. As she prepared for a public forum to share her story, Sarah stood backstage, heart racing. She could hear the audience shuffling, the murmur of expectation buzzing through the air. This is it, she thought, her palms sweaty but her resolve unyielding. When her turn came, stepping onto that stage felt like a declaration of war against ignorance. The bright lights bore down on her, illuminating the sea of faces eager to hear her story. Sarah took a deep breath, recalling everything that had led her to this moment, the dark times, the resilience it had taken to reach the light. "You are not allowed to silence me any longer." The opening words erupted from her lips, a powerful battle cry that reverberated through the crowd. "I am here to tell you about the systemic racism that pervades our society," she continued, her voice steady and clear. "I'm here to speak not just for myself, but for every person who has ever felt the weight of prejudice on their shoulders." Each word ignited a spark of connection, her audience leaning in, drawn closer to the fire of her truth. She shared her experiences, the indignities she encountered, and how they had shaped her identity, urging others to recognize their complicity in a broken system. As she spoke, she felt the energy shift, awareness awakening in those who had once been indifferent. "Change begins with us," she declared, her voice soaring, resonating with conviction. "It begins by acknowledging our biases and dismantling the walls we've built. We are more powerful united than divided." The applause erupted like thunder, echoing in the auditorium, but Sarah knew this was just the beginning. The world had started to awaken, and her heart swelled with hope for the future. When she stepped off the stage, Daniel was waiting with open arms. "You were incredible," he beamed, pride shining in his eyes. Sarah smiled, feeling the weight of the moment settle within her. This was not just a personal victory, it was a communal one. Together, they would continue to fight for justice, to create a world where no one ever again felt the sting of being unwelcome simply because of who they are. The journey would be long, and battles would still be fought, but this moment marked a pivotal change, a promise of what was to come. In the days that followed, as Sarah and her allies mobilized to push for systemic change in corporate structures, the momentum grew. It was an uphill battle, but they were determined. And as Sarah looked out at the city that had once felt so overwhelmingly isolating, she now felt a deep sense of belonging, not only for herself but for everyone who had fought for their right to exist in spaces that sought to define them through the lens of prejudice. This was just the beginning. With courage as her shield and her voice as her sword, she was ready to take on the world. I hope this dramatic script captures the intensity, emotion, and themes of overcoming prejudice you were looking for. The murmurs grew louder, a wave of disbelief rippling through the cabin as Sarah stood her ground. Melissa's expression shifted from smug amusement to outrage. "You think you can speak to me like that?" she snapped, disbelief etched across her features. "Let's be clear," Sarah shot back, her voice steady and unwavering, "I will speak when and how I choose, especially when it comes to my existence in spaces like this. Your condescension is not just an oversight, it's a refusal to acknowledge my humanity." The words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, a profound silence enveloped the cabin. All eyes were on her, some wide with shock, others narrowed in disapproval. But amidst the tension, she could see others shifting, recognition dawning in their expressions, reshaping the atmosphere. Suddenly, a voice piped up from the back of the cabin, an older black woman, seated with her family. "She's right. You all have been sitting here, judging us without even knowing our stories." The woman's voice carried a weight that resonated with truth. "You think wealth and privilege give you the right to decide who belongs where?" The solidarity in that moment ignited something profound in Sarah. "This isn't just about me," she declared, looking at the woman with gratitude. "This is about every single person who has ever faced exclusion because of the color of their skin. We are not just tokens or symbols, we are capable, driven, and deserving of respect." The atmosphere shifted. The realization that they were not alone rushed through Sarah like an electric current, prompting others to speak out. She felt a wave of support building, hands raising in solidarity, voices resonating with shared experiences. "I'm tired of being overlooked," a young man in a sharp suit chimed in, rising from his seat. "Every day in this so-called elite world, we're treated like we don't matter." "Well, guess what? We do." His words added fuel to the fire within Sarah. She had touched them deeply, and together, they began to weave a tapestry of resilience. A murmur of agreement rippled around the cabin. Sarah met the eyes of those willing to stand with her, and in that moment, they were no longer isolated voices, they had become a chorus of determination. The weight of societal failure seemed to lift for just a heartbeat, as they shared their stories, their truths mingling with Sarah's. Each revelation added layers to their growing strength, an understanding that they were not merely fighting for themselves but for each other, for all those who faced similar battles behind closed doors. The confrontation had carried them beyond the walls of the jet, broadening into a movement that promised to challenge the status quo. Amid the uproar, Melissa stepped back, clearly shaken. "I can't believe what I'm hearing," she sputtered, her voice dripping with disbelief, trying to regain control of the situation. "You all should be grateful for the opportunities you've been given." Anger burned within Sarah, igniting her resolve once more. "Opportunities? Do you think we're just grateful for scraps dropped from the table? You don't understand what it's like to struggle, to work twice as hard just to be seen as half as good." As Sarah's voice rose, she took a step forward, her heart pounding but her conviction steely. "Our voices matter. We will not be silenced or dismissed. Together, we will demand better, for ourselves and for the generations to come." Each phrase resonated deeply with the listeners, the collective energy morphing into something greater than herself, something transformative. They were more than just travelers on a plane, they were warriors, ready to confront the systemic injustices that sought to bind them. Suddenly, a woman in a business suit stood up, eyes glistening. You have no idea how much this resonates. I've spent my career being overlooked. I thought I'd have to suffer in silence. Thank you for reminding me that I don't have to. Her vulnerability opened a floodgate of emotions, unearthing shared experiences that transcended race and identity. Voices began to overlap, a swell of emotion bubbling up, each person realizing they had found a community in their shared pain and resilience. They leaned on each other, drawing strength from the collective vulnerability, weaving their stories into a narrative that could no longer be ignored. In this chaotic moment, something incredible was being forged, a movement born from oppression yet filled with hope. As the plane began its descent, Sarah felt light. She hadn't just defended herself, she had ignited a fire of resistance that would continue long after their flight had ended. The cabin was filled with laughter, shouts of support, and clinking glasses, celebrating the power of unity in confronting their shared struggles. The moment they reached the ground, Sarah knew they had all landed somewhere profound. Together, they had pushed back against the barriers of racism and prejudice, fortifying each other's courage to continue the fight for equality and respect. As they disembarked, she caught the eye of the older woman who had initially spoken out. They exchanged a knowing glance, two warriors bound in purpose. This isn't over, Sarah assured her, a sly smile breaking across her face. It's just getting started. The world may have turned a blind eye for far too long, but now, with voices united, they were ready to demand change. And with every step forward, Sarah felt the weight of injustice lighten, replaced by a fierce determination ignited in the fires of solidarity. You are not allowed to forget who you are. Daniel's voice sliced through Sarah's fog of doubt, anchoring her in a world that constantly tried to define her by her race. She glanced at him, a flicker of gratitude pushing the worry aside. In moments of weakness, his unwavering belief in her became a lifeline she desperately needed, a beacon in the storm of prejudice swirling around them. They stood together in the upscale lounge before their flight, a room filled with polished marble floors and lavish decor, symbols of wealth and privilege. Yet, as she surveyed the crowd, Sarah felt submerged in a world where acceptance hinged solely on appearances. She was acutely aware of the judgmental glances glossing over her, a black woman in a sea of predominantly white faces, their silent scrutiny was almost tangible. Don't let them define you, Daniel pressed, his eyes burning with sincerity. You've earned your place here. Remember everything you've built. Sarah took a deep breath, his words igniting a flicker of resolve deep within her. I know, but it's hard to shake off the doubts. It feels like no matter what I achieve, they only see this. She gestured vaguely at herself, the weight of unspoken prejudices pressing down on her. Then show them, he urged, a fierce light igniting in his gaze. You're not just an entrepreneur, you're a force. You won't just rise to their level, you'll exceed it. The warmth of his encouragement washed over her, rekindling the fire that had propelled her forward throughout her career. She smiled, her spirit bolstered, and nodded. You're right. I won't let them drag me down. Thank you, Daniel. The conversation turned, but the undercurrents of discomfort lingered, staining the air. As Sarah prepared for the confrontation ahead, she steadied herself against the tide of doubt. I will rise, she whispered, a mantra that would carry her through these moments. Back in the boardroom, the atmosphere felt stifling. Sarah laid out her groundbreaking tech solutions, passion radiating from her as she spoke. But the silence that followed each point made was suffocating. She could practically feel the weight of their disinterest bearing down on her. Do you really think someone like you belongs here? She could see it in their eyes, skepticism and disbelief meshed into an unspoken dismissal that gnawed at her confidence. The buzzing murmurs of disbelief echoed in her mind. What had she expected? That they would embrace her innovation without question. This wasn't supposed to happen, but it did, she thought, heart sinking as she noticed their reluctance to engage. One of her closest business partners, Kevin, who had once celebrated her victories, suddenly remained detached, the arrogance of privilege cloaking him. "We've all seen people pitch ideas," he remarked dismissively. "But that's not how you redefine the industry." The jab struck deeper than she anticipated. Betrayal hit harder than any prejudice she had encountered. "Kevin, this solution will revolutionize our approach," Sarah implored, desperation creeping into her tone. "How can you ignore the living proof in front of you?" But he brushed her off, and with it, he cast aside years of collaboration, trust, and loyalty. The sting of isolation wrapped around her like a heavy cloak, pushing away every shred of conviction. No one saw this coming. In that moment, she felt unmoored, hanging on the precipice of despair, facing an internal battle for her self-worth. Later, seated in the lounge, Sarah felt the world spinning around her, drowning in memories of the past, echoes of ridicule and scorn replaying in her mind, each one threatening to unravel the self-assured facade she had crafted over the years. The voices mentioned how she wouldn't make it, how she'd never fit into the mold. How could they judge what they hadn't lived? Suddenly, across the aisle sat an older black entrepreneur who had overheard snippets of the conference. His face held a kind familiarity, a glimmer of understanding. "Excuse me," he said gently, leaning forward. "I couldn't help but hear. We've all faced our share of those who doubt us." That simple acknowledgement caught her off guard. "This was never supposed to happen," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "But I'm tired of being overlooked. Tired of carrying the weight of the judgments on my shoulders." He nodded solemnly. "You have every right to be proud of who you are. Let their doubts ignite your fire instead of snuffing it out. Every person's journey is different, and every burden we bear only makes us stronger." His words felt like a balm over her wounds, and slowly, hope crept back in. In that dimly lit cabin, they swapped stories, sharing battles fought and victories won, each tale resonating deeply between them. This was the mentoring she had desperately needed, the encouragement forged in shared experiences. "The truth will shock you," he said, gripping her shoulder. "But remember, every scar tells a story. Use them to light your path." The conversation turned to her family and heritage, drawing out chains of memories that reminded Sarah of the resilience rooted in her lineage. Those battles against systemic oppression reflected the unresolved pain she carried, yet they were also a source of strength that bolstered her resolve. "How dare they challenge my journey," she thought, recalling the generational struggles laid bare around the dinner table. Dialogues often led to chasms between her traditional family's views and her modern fight for justice. "Why can't they see that the times are changing?" The older man's laughter softened her heart. "You've got the fire within you. Don't let yesterday define today." Steeling herself, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. They thought they could get away with it, but she was determined to prove otherwise. With each step toward the future, the path to justice unfolded before her, vibrant with possibility. Each moment of unexpected support ignited her spirit, affirming that she was not alone in the struggle against prejudice. The tiny sparks turned into flames, stoking her determination to break through the barriers that stacked against her. "You're right," she asserted, holding her head high in that moral reckoning. "I will rise. I will fight." She knew the personal journey ahead would be fraught with challenges, but they would not deter her. Sarah felt poised to challenge a world that turned a blind eye, until now. And with that resolve, she set her sights on achieving change, ready to step into the fray and claim not just her identity, but the legacy she would leave behind. Melissa's voice echoed like a thunderclap, shattering the silence as she pointed at Sarah. "You are not allowed to be here." The words sliced through the luxurious atmosphere of the private jet, transforming it into a battleground, every eye turning to witness the unfolding humiliation. Sarah felt the weight of judgment on her shoulders, 1,000 silent accusations swirling in the tense air. "What are you talking about?" Sarah managed to respond, her heart racing. She was dressed in an elegant suit, a self-made billionaire among wealthy elites, yet in this moment, she felt like a trespasser in a world that had never truly welcomed her. Melissa's smirk deepened as she continued, "This flight is for our esteemed clients. You don't look like you belong here." The words dripped with condescension, feeding the whispers that filled the cabin. Sarah's stomach twisted with a mix of anger and humiliation, the judgmental stares from her fellow passengers piercing through her like daggers. In that moment, her mind raced through the years of struggles, the countless challenges she had overcome to sit here, a testament to her success. "Do you really think someone like you belongs here?" The thought echoed in her head, a manifestation of all her fears laid bare. Surrounded by judgmental stares, Sarah felt the ground beneath her crumbling. Each condescending word from Melissa reinforced the idea that they saw her not as a successful entrepreneur, but as a threat to their fragile status quo. She could feel the collective disapproval stinging worse than any critique she had received in her professional career. This was never supposed to happen. The heat of shame flushed over her cheeks as whispers rippled through the cabin, an invisible current of disdain. Sarah's hands clenched into fists, her resolve slipping as she fought against the rising tide of embarrassment. "I deserve to be here just as much as anyone else," she shouted suddenly, the defiance bursting forth unfiltered. But in that moment, it felt like throwing stones into a tempest, a small act against a force far greater than her own. The cabin went silent, but it was a silence that felt suffocating. No one intervened. Instead, they watched, some with open curiosity, others with judgment, dissecting her every move. Everything she had achieved, every moment of triumph, began to seem like a fragile facade crumbling under pressure. No one saw this coming, she thought as the silence stretched on, feeling her dignity slipping away. The humiliation forced her to confront not just external prejudice but the internalized doubts that had haunted her for years. Could she withstand this moment? Could she rise above it? As despair threatened to engulf her, a flicker of resolve ignited within Sarah. She could already feel her spirit waning as the laughter from the front of the cabin continued, the luxury around her suddenly feeling like a cage. "The truth will shock you," whispered a voice in her mind, echoing words shared by her mentor. She had been reminded time and again of the power of her story, the power of standing firm in the face of adversity. "I will not let this define me," Sarah whispered to herself. "I will rise against the humiliation." She steeled herself, determined to fight for her dignity and assert her place in this space. A decision that changed everything exploded within her. This was not a moment of defeat but a turning point, not just for her, but for others who faced similar battles in silence. No more would she allow the fear of judgment to shroud her spirit. Drawing the breath of a warrior, Sarah took a step forward, her heart racing. They thought they could get away with it, but they were wrong. She would take a stand, not just for herself but for everyone who had been made to feel small by prejudice. "I've worked tirelessly to be here," she declared, her voice ringing with a ferocity she hadn't known she possessed. "I've earned my place, and with that comes the responsibility to speak up for those who can't." The whispers morphed into gasps, bewildered faces transforming to contemplation. Suddenly, the mood in the cabin began to shift. The once glaring eyes that sought to judge now held a semblance of respect, others began to nod, realizing the truth in her words. "I want you all to understand," she continued, the fire of conviction igniting her passion. "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who has had to fight to be heard. Every voice that has been silenced needs to be amplified." With each word, she felt the heavy chains of shame and doubt begin to shatter, replaced by an empowering resolve that surged within her veins. As the flight continued on its path through the clouds, she looked around the cabin, sensing the shift in energy. The tide was turning. Sarah felt fueled by solidarity and courage, ready to challenge not just the prejudice faced in this moment, but the systemic issues that had lingered far too long unchecked. In the minutes that followed, she realized her journey was evolving beyond personal struggle. It was blossoming into a movement, an awakening that invited others to challenge the status quo. Sarah felt a powerful change sprouting from within her, this was only the beginning of a much greater fight. On arriving back on solid ground, she would take this resonance, a determined manifesto of change, and harness it into action. She would not merely exist in these spaces, she would own them. And in doing so, she would offer countless others the same courage to rise, to voice, and to transform their realities. From that point on, Sarah was no longer just an entrepreneur, she was a force for justice, fighting for her place in the world and, more importantly, for those who felt that the world had no place for them. And together, they would be unstoppable. You are not allowed to silence me any longer. Sarah's voice rang through the crowded forum like a battle cry, echoing off the walls of the lavish auditorium that had always seemed designed to stifle boldness. Today was different, lights blazed above, illuminating a sea of faces staring back at her, some startled, others intrigued, but all captivated. Her allies stood behind her, Daniel and a few others, silently urging her on as she took the central stage. We are here today because the truth can no longer be hidden. The weight of those words settled in the room, heavy and undeniable. Today was about unleashing a torrent of truth against an institution that had long kept her, and others like her, oppressed. With fierce determination, Sarah faced down the airline representatives seated in front of her, her pulse quickening with each passing moment. The dismissive gestures from their team fueled her resolve, a raised eyebrow here, a smirk there, all promoting the idea that they held the power and she was simply an inconvenience. But this time, she felt the defiance flare in her eyes, carving out a space for her voice to be heard. It is time to reclaim my narrative, she thought fiercely, her heart racing. Sarah took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders as she locked eyes with the lead representative, Melissa. The contempt that dripped from Melissa's expression was palpable, but it only further ignited the fire within Sarah. This was never supposed to happen, but it had. As cameras rolled and the audience leaned in, she felt the gravity of the moment overshadow everything she feared. The weight of countless unseen injustices bore down on her shoulders like a heavy cross, and she was ready to expose it all. I stand here today not just as a woman who has transcended obstacles, she proclaimed, voice steady and powerful, but as a representative of all marginalized voices who have been silenced, overlooked, and oppressed. The room stirred as Sarah continued, her words taking flight like caged birds finally freed. The truth about her experiences flowed with clarity and conviction, punctuated by hard-hitting statistics and gut-wrenching anecdotes. She painted a vivid picture of systemic racism, not just the overt kind, but the subtle nuances woven into the fabric of everyday interactions. Did you know that black women in corporate environments are turned away for promotions at a rate 5 times higher than their white counterparts? She challenged, surveying the audience. The revelation of her experiences reverberated through the room, demanding the attention of those who had become complacent in their privilege. It's time for every one of you to confront your biases. In the back, Melissa shifted uncomfortably, her once smug demeanor now fracturing as Sarah's words pierced through her defenses. They thought they could rid themselves of the uncomfortable truths, Sarah thought, her heart racing as she saw the power dynamics begin to shift. The atmosphere thickened with tension as she exposed the cracks in the airline's facade, peeling back layers that had obscured injustice for far too long. Her words were no longer just a narrative, they were a call to action. This was a moment that changed everything, a crescendo that fueled a rising wave of collective anger and frustration. As Sarah embraced her newfound power, she recognized that this was more than her fight, it was a movement. The energy in the room transformed, igniting the passion of those who had silently endured the same struggles, as stories of prejudice spilled forth from fellow attendees. Voices of support harmonized with Sarah's, creating an echoing chorus of solidarity. "You're not alone, we stand with you," someone shouted from the crowd, and a wave of applause followed, drowning the silence that had previously stifled them. As Sarah embraced this united front, she felt invincible, a beacon of hope shining through the darkness of oppression. Their collective strength amplified her voice, together, they defied the societal constructs that sought to keep them divided. Then, the defining moment arrived. "The truth will shock you," Sarah said, pointing directly at Melissa, who shifted uneasily in her seat. This isn't just about what you did to me, it's about everything your institution represents. It's time to reckon with that truth. The room fell into a hush, every eye fixed on her. The realization dawned on many that it was indeed time for accountability and change. Sarah could feel the atmosphere crackling with a newfound energy, a tension that indicated something profound was shifting. Finally, Melissa's expression faltered, betraying the facade of superiority she had worn so confidently. The unyielding grip of prejudice began to falter, and as Sarah pressed forward, she knew the moment had arrived. With a sharp breath, Sarah continued, "You underestimate the power of our voices. You think this will die down, that we will just go away, but it will not. We are the ones who will transform this industry." The applause that followed resonated through the hall, a roaring affirmation that echoed into the distance. Everyone felt it, the power of truth illuminating their path forward. As Sarah stood firm, she saw a flicker of realization in the eyes of those who had once ridden high on waves of privilege. Recognition of their complicity in the systemic injustices they had long ignored was finally dawning. The atmosphere thickened with the gravity of the moment as her truth took hold. She understood that this was the beginning, a movement rising from the ashes of personal and collective suffering. Sarah's allies stood beside her, united in purpose, their shared strength becoming a testament to resilience that arises when oppressed voices demand to be heard. The room pulsed with the promise of change, igniting a fire that could not be extinguished. In that pivotal moment, Sarah knew they had created something that could never be undone. The fight for justice had begun, and together they were ready for the journey ahead. "You are not allowed to forget your worth." The words spun through Sarah's mind as she stood amidst the aftermath of the confrontation, her heart racing with a mix of anger and clarity. In that moment, she fully understood that her struggles had shaped her identity, crafting a mosaic of resilience from the pain and humiliation she had endured. Each challenge had become a thread woven into a tapestry that radiated strength, a strength that now ignited a fire deep within her. As the echoes of disbelief faded, Sarah surveyed the faces around her, some conflicted, some supportive. The exhilaration of having raised her voice lingered in the air, but the weight of the battle still loomed ahead. "How dare they underestimate my voice?" she thought with fierce resolve. The world had tried to mute her, but she had burned too brightly to be ignored any longer. It was time to amplify her story, to lift up the narratives of others often overshadowed by systemic racism. In reflecting on the long road that lay ahead, she knew that justice was not a single destination, it was an ongoing journey filled with twists and turns. This was never supposed to end here, she reminded herself, gripping the podium tightly as she recalled all that she still needed to accomplish. The battle for change was just beginning, not just for herself, but for all those impacted by discrimination and prejudice. The truth will shock you. Sarah could feel the stirring of something monumental within her. Her bravery had sparked a flicker of hope, igniting conversations among her peers that appeared to ripple out far beyond what she could see. Slowly but surely, she began to notice glimmers of change where once there had been only shadows. As she stepped from the stage, a wave of anxiety washed over her. She took a deep breath and made a choice, often uncomfortable but necessary. She would become a visible catalyst for dialogue on the repercussions of racism in every sphere, weaving her story into the fabric of the collective fight for equality. "They thought they could silence me," she thought as her resolve solidified. The whispers surrounding her had become a clarion call for action, echoing back the words of those who had also long been silenced. It wasn't just her fight anymore, it was a movement, a ripple effect of courage that spread through her community like wildfire. Conversations began erupting in every corner, offices, homes, online platforms, challenging the status quo right where it stood. Sarah felt invigorated by the discussions taking place, emboldened to join people from diverse backgrounds united in their quest for justice. The law failed her today in many ways, she had stood bewailing at the barriers, but she realized that throughout her journey, those very obstacles had only strengthened her resolve. Each everyday act of defiance against prejudice was a building block toward broader transformation and a more equitable future. As a sense of hope surged within her, Sarah reflected on the defining moment she had just lived. She was no longer simply a woman confronting prejudice, she was part of a powerful collective, a force advocating for lasting change. Together, they would transform the very narrative around race and identity. In the days that followed, Sarah launched a campaign, Voices Unbound. With her network of allies, she began organizing forums, discussions, and social media initiatives to challenge the status quo. No more would they stay silenced, the truth of their experiences demanded recognition. "We are here to dismantle the walls built to divide us," she proclaimed in her initial video address. "Together, we are strong, and together, we will rise." As messages poured in from individuals resonating with her fight, Sarah felt renewed purpose. People began sharing their own narratives of overcoming prejudice, enveloping her with strength. The tide was shifting, and she was at the forefront, committed to challenging the structures that had upheld discrimination for far too long. Hope that transcends adversity grew within her. Each success felt like a victory for everyone who had ever fought to be heard. "Together, we will forge a path for future generations to walk on solid ground," she envisioned. At long last, she understood that every struggle she faced had brought her to this very moment. Sarah was ready, not just to confront the injustices in her world but to uplift others in their journeys as well. Standing on the precipice of a new dawn, she felt the surge of possibility. The fight was just beginning, and she was no longer walking it alone. Together, they would rise, shattering the silence of oppression with a symphony of resilience, courage, and hope. And as she looked toward the future, her heart swelled with determination, knowing that the power of change had indeed taken root.